Dawn arrived late to this corner of Europe. A dense, gray fog wrapped around the damaged hangars, and the smell of kerosene mixed with wet earth saturated the cold morning air. Major Klaus Steiner watched the sky through the cracked briefing room window, his tired blue eyes fixed on the low clouds that seemed to herald something beyond simple rain. Behind him, 3 other Luftwaffe pilots sat in uncomfortable silence. They were young men with old faces, marked by sleepless nights and the constant weight of a war they knew was slipping through their fingers like sand. On the wall, a faded map of Europe showed red markings advancing from all directions, like a noose slowly tightening. "Gentlemen," Steiner began, his voice hoarse from too many cigarettes and too few words of hope, "today we fly the Messerschmitt Me-262 Schwalbe again, the most advanced aircraft in the world." A thin smile crossed the face of Lieutenant Hans Weber, the youngest of the group at barely 22 years old. "The Americans don't have anything that can catch us, Herr Major. Their Mustangs are toys compared to our jets." Steiner didn't respond immediately. He remembered when he too had believed in invincibility. That was before losing half his squadron, before watching friends turn into names on casualty lists, before understanding that technological superiority meant nothing when you were outnumbered 10-1. "Confidence is good, Weber," Steiner finally said, turning to face the young pilot. "Arrogance kills. Remember that." The briefing was short. Their mission: intercept American bomber formations heading toward Munich. Intelligence reported a group of B-17 Flying Fortresses escorted by P-51 Mustangs. Routine, they said. Nothing the Me-262s couldn't handle with their superior speed. 45 minutes later, 28,000 feet above southern Germany, the roar of the UMO-004 turbojets was different from anything Klaus had heard in his years of flying. Not the rhythmic pulse of piston engines, but a continuous, almost supernatural howl, like the scream of a creature that shouldn't exist. Inside the cockpit of his Me-262, the world became a bubble of aluminum, plexiglass, and instruments that glowed with a pale green light. Through his canopy, Klaus could see Weber's aircraft flying in formation to his right. The young pilot waggled his wings, a gesture of confidence, perhaps even joy. Klaus felt a knot form in his stomach. He had seen too many confident young men disappear into clouds and never return. "Adler, leader. This is Adler 2. Weber's voice crackled through the radio. "I have visual contact with the bomber formation. 11 o'clock, slightly below." Klaus adjusted his heading and spotted them. A formation of American B-17s, their silver bodies glinting in the weak sunlight that filtered through the clouds. Around them, like protective wolves, circled the P-51 Mustangs. Beautiful, deadly aircraft that had already claimed too many of his comrades. "All Adler units prepare for attack run," Klaus commanded, his hand tightening on the control stick. "Remember your speed advantage. Strike fast and break away. Don't engage the escorts in turning combat." The Me-262 dove through the sky like a falcon. The airspeed indicator climbed rapidly. 500 kilometers per hour, 600, 700. The bombers grew larger in his gun sight. Klaus could see the gunners in their turrets, could almost imagine their faces as they spotted the approaching German jets. His finger hovered over the firing button. 4 30mm Mk-108 cannons waited to unleash their destructive power. This was the moment when training, instinct, and survival merged into a single action. This was the moment when young men tried not to think about the other young men they were about to. "Adler leader, break right, break right." Weber's voice exploded in his headset, panic replacing confidence. Klaus yanked the stick hard, his body pressed against the seat by G-forces. Something flashed past his left wing. Too fast to identify, too close to ignore. His heart hammered in his chest as he struggled to regain control, to understand what had just happened. "What was that?" he shouted into the radio. "Weber, report." Static. Then Weber's voice, thin and trembling. "Herr Major, I don't know what I just saw, but it wasn't a Mustang. It was faster, much faster. Klaus scanned the sky, his trained eyes searching for threats. The bomber formation continued its steady course, the P-51s still circling protectively. But there, high and to the east, he saw them. Two aircraft unlike anything he had ever seen. They were sleek, silver, with straight wings and a shape that seemed to mock every principle of aerodynamics he had learned. But what captured his attention, what made his blood run cold, was their speed. They were faster than his Me-262. "All units, new contacts at 3 o'clock high," Klaus reported, trying to keep his voice steady. "Unknown aircraft type, maintain defensive formation." The two mysterious aircraft descended in a shallow dive, their approach calculated and precise. As they drew closer, Klaus could make out details. A single jet engine intake in the nose, a bubble canopy, and, most disturbing of all, a white star on their wings. American markings. "Impossible," he whispered to himself. "The Americans don't have jets. Our intelligence said—" The thought was interrupted as one of the unknown aircraft accelerated past him with a speed that defied belief. The sonic signature was different from his Jumo engines, cleaner, more powerful, more refined. In that moment, Klaus understood what it meant to be technologically surpassed. The American jet, whatever it was, positioned itself behind Weber's Me-262 with practiced ease. Klaus watched in horror as tracer rounds cut through the air, walking up toward his young wingman's aircraft. "Weber, evasive maneuvers, now!" But the Me-262, for all its revolutionary design, was a heavy aircraft. It didn't turn well, it didn't respond quickly to sudden inputs, and the American jet, this ghost that shouldn't exist, stayed glued to Weber's tail like a shadow. Klaus pushed his throttles forward, trying to intercept, trying to save the young pilot who had smiled just minutes ago. But he was too far, too slow, too late. Weber's aircraft shuddered as rounds found their mark. Smoke began trailing from the left engine. The Me-262 entered a shallow descent, trailing black smoke like a funeral shroud across the German sky. "I'm hit! I'm losing power!" Weber's voice was high-pitched with fear. "Herr Major, what are these things?" Klaus had no answer. He watched Weber's aircraft descend toward the clouds below, watched the American jet break off and climb back to altitude with an ease that seemed to mock German engineering, mock their superiority, mock everything they had believed about their technological advantage. "Adler, leader to all units," Klaus said, his voice hollow. "Break off attack. Return to base. Now." As his remaining pilots turned for home, Klaus took one last look at the two American jets. They circled above like predators, like harbingers of a future that had arrived too soon. One of them waggled its wings, not in greeting, but in dismissal, a gesture that said, "Your time is over." Klaus turned his Me-262 westward, toward the base, toward the debriefing where he would have to explain the inexplicable. In the distance, he could see a parachute descending through the clouds. Weber had managed to escape. At least there was that. But as he flew through the cold German sky, Klaus Steiner understood that something fundamental had shifted. The Luftwaffe commanders who had laughed at American aviation, who had mocked their lack of jet technology, who had believed the Me-262 made them untouchable, they had been wrong, and the cost of that arrogance was just beginning to reveal itself. The debriefing room felt smaller than it had that morning. Major Klaus Steiner stood before a map of Germany that seemed to shrink with each passing day, red pins marking Allied advances that no amount of optimism could deny. Behind a heavy oak desk sat Colonel Ernst Dietrich, a man whose iron cross seemed to weigh heavier on his chest with each defeat. "You're telling me," Dietrich said slowly, his fingers drumming on the desk, "that American jets outran our Me-262s?" Klaus nodded, his jaw tight. "Not just outran, Herr Oberst. They outmaneuvered us. They were faster in level flight, faster in climbs, and their acceleration was—" Superior. The silence that followed was broken only by the distant sound of sirens. Another air raid warning, another reminder that Germany's skies were no longer their own. Impossible, Dietrich finally said, though his voice lacked conviction. Our intelligence reports show nothing. No American jet program, no operational aircraft, nothing. With respect, sir, our intelligence has been wrong before. Klaus kept his tone measured, professional. What I saw today was real. Weber is alive because he managed to bail out, but his aircraft is lost. And if these American jets are operational... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Dietrich stood and walked to the window, his hands clasped behind his back in a posture that had once signaled authority but now seemed more like a shield against reality. The Führer was promised that the Me-262 would turn the tide, Dietrich said quietly, that our jet technology would give us air superiority, that we would drive the Allied bombers from our skies. Perhaps we believed our own propaganda too readily, sir. Dietrich turned sharply, his eyes flashing with something between anger and despair. Careful, Major. Such words can be considered defeatist. Truth isn't defeatism, Herr Oberst. It's survival. Meanwhile, 30 miles south, Field Hospital near Augsburg, Lieutenant Hans Weber sat on the edge of a medical cot, his hands still trembling despite the morphine the doctors had given him for his sprained ankle. The parachute landing had been rough, but he was alive, a luxury many of his friends no longer enjoyed. A nurse with tired eyes offered him water. He drank gratefully, though the liquid did nothing to wash away the memory of those silver shapes in the sky. "You were lucky," the nurse said softly. "The farmer who found you said you were speaking about angels, silver angels that moved like lightning." Weber looked up at her, and for a moment he considered lying, considered saying it was the shock, the trauma, the fear playing tricks on his mind. But the memory was too vivid, too real, too terrifying to dismiss. "They weren't angels," he whispered. "They were American jets, and they were better than ours." The nurse's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or fear. She had heard too many impossible stories lately, stories of weapons that defied understanding, of a war that had moved beyond anything their training had prepared them for. "Rest," she said simply. "The war will still be here when you wake up." But Weber knew he wouldn't sleep, not with those images burned into his memory. Not knowing that everything he had been told about German superiority was crumbling like the cities around them. March 16th, 1945, somewhere over the Atlantic Ocean. Captain James "Jimmy" Harrison sat in the cockpit of a C-54 transport aircraft, watching the sun set over an ocean that seemed to stretch into infinity. In the cargo hold behind him, carefully covered and guarded, sat two of America's most secret weapons, P-80, shooting stars destined for European deployment. Jimmy wasn't a jet pilot. He flew transports, ferrying equipment and personnel across an ocean that had swallowed too many good men. But he had been briefed on his cargo with an intensity that made it clear. What he carried represented more than just aircraft. It represented the future. "Penny for your thoughts, Captain," his co-pilot, Lieutenant Tom Crawford, asked from the right seat. "Just thinking about what's in the back," Jimmy replied, his eyes still on the horizon. "They say these jets can outrun anything the Germans have, that they'll end the war faster." "And you don't believe it?" Jimmy was quiet for a moment, listening to the steady drone of the C-54's engines. "I believe in what I can see, Tom. I've seen too many wonder weapons that didn't work, too many promises that fell apart in combat. Metal and engines don't win wars. Men do." "Spoken like a true transport pilot," Tom said with a smile. "No romance, just reality." "Romance gets people killed." The radio crackled to life, breaking their conversation. "Transport 7-3, this is Gander Control. Be advised, you're cleared for final approach. Weather is holding, visibility good." "Roger, Gander Control. Beginning descent." As the C-54 dropped through the clouds toward Newfoundland, Jimmy thought about the pilots who would fly those jets in the back. Young men, probably, full of confidence and courage. Men who didn't yet understand that every technological advantage was temporary, that today's miracle became tomorrow's target. He hoped they would learn that lesson without paying the ultimate price. March 17, 1945, Lechfeld Air Base. Dawn, Close stood beside his Me-262, running his hand along the cold metal fuselage. The ground crew had repaired the damage from yesterday's mission. Bullet holes patched, systems checked, fuel tanks filled. The aircraft was ready to fly again. But was he? Herr Major? Klaus turned to find Weber approaching, limping slightly but otherwise intact. The young pilot's face had changed in the 24 hours since his near-death experience. The boyish enthusiasm had been replaced by something harder, something older. "You should be in the hospital, Weber." "I've been grounded, sir. Doctor's orders. But I wanted to. I needed to see you before your next mission." Klaus waited, studying the younger man's face. "What we saw up there," Weber continued, his voice low, "it changes everything, doesn't it? All those jokes about American engineering, about their inability to match our technology. We were wrong." "Yes," Klaus said simply, "we were wrong. Then why are we still flying? If they have better aircraft, more pilots, more resources, why are we still pretending we can win?" The question hung in the cold morning air like a challenge, like an accusation. Klaus had asked himself the same thing countless times, in the dark hours when sleep wouldn't come and memories crowded in like unwelcome guests. "Because surrender isn't an option they've given us," Klaus finally answered. "Because our families are still here, our cities are still standing. Barely. Because every day we fly is another day they don't. It's not about winning anymore, Weber. It's about surviving long enough to see tomorrow." Weber nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. "And what happens when tomorrow comes and we're not there to see it? Then someone else will remember. Someone else will tell the story of men who flew when flying was impossible, who fought when fighting was futile. History doesn't just belong to the victors, Weber. It belongs to everyone who had the courage to face it." The base loudspeaker crackled to life, announcing the morning briefing. Klaus straightened his flight jacket and began walking toward the operations building. Behind him, Weber called out, "Herr Major, those American jets? What do you think they're called?" Klaus stopped and turned. "Does it matter? A weapon by any name still ends lives." "I suppose you're right, sir. But I'd like to know the name of the thing that nearly ended mine." Klaus considered this for a moment, then shook his head. "Perhaps we'll find out soon enough. Perhaps too soon." As he walked away, Klaus didn't see the American reconnaissance aircraft passing high overhead, its cameras recording everything below. Didn't know that in Washington and London, analysts were studying images of German air bases, counting aircraft, planning the next phase of a war that was rapidly approaching its conclusion. Didn't know that the P-80 shooting stars, the ghosts that had shattered Luftwaffe confidence, were being deployed in greater numbers, with better-trained pilots, with one mission: establish complete air superiority. The sun rose over Lechfeld, casting long shadows across the tarmac. In those shadows, the shapes of aircraft seemed almost spectral, as if they were already fading into history. Klaus Steiner looked up at the sky, at the clouds that held both beauty and death, and wondered how many more dawns he would see. The answer, he knew, would come soon enough. In the distance, the sound of jet engines, not the familiar Umo turbojets of German aircraft, but something else, something newer, echoed across the valley like a promise, or a threat. Captain Richard Dick Bong stood in front of the sleekest aircraft he had ever seen. The P-80 shooting star gleamed under the weak English sun, its silver skin reflecting clouds that scudded across the sky like racing thoughts. He had flown P-38 Lightnings over the Pacific, had 40 confirmed victories to his name, and thought he understood what fast meant. This aircraft redefined the word. "She's a beauty, isn't she, Captain?" The voice belonged to Colonel Marcus Webb, the officer in charge of the 412th Fighter Group, the first American jet fighter squadron deployed to Europe. "She's different," Dick replied, his Midwestern accent softening the observation. "No propeller, single engine. Everything about her goes against what I learned." "Everything you learned is about to become history," Webb said, walking around the aircraft with proprietary pride. "The Germans have had jets in combat for months. The Me-262 has been tearing through our bomber formations when we can't get escorts high enough fast enough. But now—" He patted the P-80's fuselage. "Now we have an answer." Dick climbed the ladder and settled into the cockpit. The layout was familiar yet alien. Throttle, stick, rudder pedals, but the instrument panel glowed with new gauges, new indicators, new possibilities. The jet engine didn't growl like a piston engine. It whispered promises of speed that made his pulse quicken. "Your first combat mission is tomorrow," Webb said from below. "Intelligence reports that the Luftwaffe has concentrated their Me-262s at Lechfeld. They're protecting the approaches to Munich. Your job is simple. Establish air superiority. Show them that American engineering isn't something to laugh at." Dick nodded, his hands moving over the controls with practiced familiarity. "And if we encounter their jets? Then we find out if all this technology actually works in combat. Theory meets reality, Captain. And may God have mercy on whoever gets it wrong." March 21st, 1945, 05:45 hours, Lechfeld Air Base. Klaus Steiner woke to the sound of sirens. Not the wailing alert of incoming bombers, something different, something urgent. He dressed quickly, his fingers fumbling with buttons in the pre-dawn darkness, and ran toward the operations building. The briefing room was chaos. Pilots crowded around the map table, voices raised in confusion and alarm. Colonel Dietrich stood at the center, his face ashen in the harsh light of the overhead lamps. "Gentlemen, silence!" Dietrich's voice cut through the noise. "We have received intelligence from reconnaissance units. American fighters believed to be jet aircraft are being staged at forward bases in France and England. Intelligence estimates at least 20 operational aircraft." A murmur rippled through the assembled pilots. 20 didn't sound like many until you remembered that each one was potentially superior to their Me-262s. "Our orders are unchanged," Dietrich continued. "Protect the industrial targets around Munich. Intercept bomber formations. Maintain air superiority over the Reich." He paused, his eyes sweeping across the room. "And if you encounter these American jets, use your superior experience. Use your training. Remember that we have been flying jets in combat while they are just learning." Klaus caught the unspoken message. Experience might be their only advantage now. "Major Steiner," Dietrich called out, "you will lead the morning patrol. 4 aircraft, high-altitude sweep, launch in 30 minutes. Klaus nodded, already mentally preparing for what might come. Around him, pilots dispersed to their aircraft, their faces showing a mixture of determination and barely concealed fear. These were not the confident young men who had once believed in inevitable victory. These were survivors, and survivors knew the difference between courage and foolishness. Outside, the Me-262s waited like metal predators, their swept wings cutting angular shadows across the tarmac. Ground crews swarmed over them, performing final checks with practiced efficiency. Klaus approached his aircraft, running through his pre-flight inspection with mechanical precision. "Herr Major?" A young mechanic appeared at his elbow, holding out a thermos. "Coffee, sir. It's not good, but it's hot." Klaus accepted it gratefully, savoring the bitter warmth. "What's your name, soldier?" "Private Miller, sir. I've been your crew chief for 3 months." 3 months, Klaus repeated, surprised he hadn't noticed. In the chaos of daily survival, individual faces blurred together. "Thank you, Muller, for the coffee and for keeping this beast flying." The young man smiled, pride breaking through his exhaustion. "She'll bring you home, sir. I promise." Klaus wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that mettle and skill and luck would be enough. Instead, he simply nodded and climbed into the cockpit, where promises meant nothing and only actions mattered. Euro 615, hours, 32,000 feet above Bavaria. The world at altitude was a realm of crystal clarity and deadly cold. Klaus led his flight in a wide patrol pattern, his eyes constantly scanning the sky for the telltale contrails that meant combat. Behind him flew 3 other Me-262s, experienced pilots all, men who had survived this long through a combination of skill and caution. "Adler Leader, this is Adler 3, a voice crackled over the radio. "I have contacts, low and to the north. Multiple aircraft, heading southeast." Klaus adjusted his heading and spotted them. A formation of American bombers, B-17s judging by their distinctive silhouettes. Around them, the expected P-51 Mustang escorts circled like protective sheepdogs. "All Adler units, prepare for attack run. Target the bomber formation. Avoid prolonged engagement with escorts. Remember your speed advantage." The words came automatically, drilled into him by months of combat. But even as he spoke them, Klaus felt a prickling at the base of his skull, the instinct that had kept him alive when so many others had perished. Something was wrong. The sky above the bombers was empty. Too empty. The Americans had learned to position high cover, fighters that could dive down on attacking aircraft. So, where were they? "Adler Leader, this is Adler 2. I have new contacts, high and behind us. 6 o'clock, maybe 5,000 feet above." Klaus's blood turned to ice. He craned his neck, looking back and up, and saw them. 4 silver shapes diving out of the sun with the precision of raptors. P-80 shooting stars. "All units, break formation. Defensive maneuvers." The radio exploded with chatter as the German jets scattered, each pilot instinctively seeking survival in the 3-dimensional chess game of aerial combat. Klaus pulled his Me-262 into a steep climb, pushing the Jumo engines to their limits, watching his airspeed indicator climb toward dangerous speeds. Behind him, one of the American jets followed with infuriating ease. Klaus had flown against the best Allied pilots, Americans, British, Russians. He had learned their tactics, their preferences, their weaknesses. But this was different. The P-80 stayed with him through the climb, matching his speed, closing the distance with mechanical inevitability. He rolled hard left, pulling into a dive that made his vision gray at the edges. The Me-262 responded sluggishly. It was a fast aircraft in a straight line, but it turned like a truck. The P-80 followed, its tighter turning radius bringing it inside Klaus's circle. Tracer rounds flashed past his canopy, close enough that he could see individual bullets streaking through the air like deadly fireflies. Klaus pulled harder, feeling the aircraft shudder on the edge of a stall, knowing that one mistake would be his last. "Adler 3 is hit," a voice screamed over the radio. "I'm losing." Static. Klaus forced himself not to look, not to think about which of his men had just died. Focus on flying. Focus on surviving. Everything else was distraction, and distraction meant death. He dove through a layer of clouds, the white mist temporarily obscuring everything. When he emerged below, he immediately rolled inverted and pulled back on the stick, turning the dive into a climbing reversal that would have torn the wings off lesser aircraft. The P-80 followed. "Damn it," Klaus muttered, his mind racing through options. The American pilot was good, very good. Perhaps as experienced as Klaus himself, but flying a superior machine. In a contest between equal skills, the better aircraft won every time. Another burst of gunfire, closer this time. Klaus felt the aircraft shudder as rounds impacted his left wing. Warning lights blazed on his instrument panel, hydraulic pressure dropping, fuel leak detected, left engine running hot. He was hit. Not fatally, not yet, but enough to tip the scales even further in favor of his pursuer. Klaus made a decision that went against every instinct. He chopped his throttles and extended his dive brakes. The Me-262 decelerated violently, the sudden drag throwing him forward against his straps. Behind him, the P-80 shot past, unable to slow down quickly enough. For one precious moment, Klaus had the advantage. The American jet filled his gun sight, vulnerable and exposed. His finger tightened on the trigger. 4 30mm cannons roared to life, spitting high-explosive rounds toward the silver aircraft. He saw strikes along the fuselage, saw pieces of metal torn away by the devastating firepower. But the P-80 didn't explode, didn't spiral out of control. Instead, it rolled away with damaged grace, trailing a thin stream of smoke but still flying, still dangerous. "Adler leader to all units," Klaus called, his voice hoarse. "Break off engagement. Return to base." Now! He didn't wait to see if anyone followed orders. He pointed his damaged Me-262 toward home and pushed the throttles forward, ignoring the warning lights, ignoring the smoke starting to seep into his cockpit, ignoring everything except the desperate need to put distance between himself and those silver ghosts. Behind him, the P-80s didn't pursue. They had made their point. 14:30 hours, Lechfeld Air Base. Klaus sat in the debriefing room, his flight suit still stained with hydraulic fluid and sweat. Of the 4 Me-262s that had launched that morning, only 2 had returned. Adler 3 was confirmed destroyed, the pilot killed. Adler 4 had crash-landed 20 miles from base, the pilot alive but badly injured. Colonel Dietrich looked older than he had that morning. "Your assessment, Major?" Klaus chose his words carefully. "The American jets are superior in almost every measurable way. Faster, more maneuverable, better acceleration. The only advantage we had was firepower, and even that wasn't enough. And the pilots? Experienced, very experienced. They flew like men who had seen combat before, who understood not just their aircraft but aerial warfare itself." Dietrich nodded slowly, absorbing information he clearly didn't want to hear. "High Command insists the Me-262 is still superior. That pilot skill will overcome any technological disadvantage. High Command isn't flying against these aircraft, sir." The silence that followed was broken by the sound of air raid sirens. Another attack, another day in a war that Germany was losing piece by piece, aircraft by aircraft, pilot by pilot. Klaus stood, his body aching from the stress of combat. "Permission to be dismissed, Herr Oberst?" "Granted, and Major, tomorrow we fly again." "Yes, sir, tomorrow we fly again." As Klaus walked out into the fading afternoon light, he looked up at the sky and saw contrails, high and white and ominous. American bombers, American escorts, and now American jets. The sky that had once belonged to the Luftwaffe, that had once been their domain, now belonged to others. And somewhere out there, in a base across the lines, an American pilot named Dick Bong was probably looking at the same sky, thinking the same thoughts, preparing for the same endless cycle of combat and survival. 2 men, 2 nations, 2 technologies colliding in the thin air above a dying empire. The war wasn't over yet, but everyone could see how it would end. Captain Dick Bong sat in the pilot's ready room, staring at the damage assessment report from his last mission. His P-80 had taken hits, 30mm cannon rounds that had punched through the fuselage and severed hydraulic lines. The aircraft was repairable, the ground crew assured him, but it had been close. Too close. "The German pilot was good," Dick said to Colonel Webb, who stood nearby reviewing mission logs. "Experienced. He used a maneuver I've never seen before, suddenly reducing speed to force an overshoot. Nearly worked, too." Webb looked up from his paperwork. "Nearly isn't good enough in combat, Captain. You're alive. He ran home with his tail between his legs. That's what matters." "Is it?" Dick set down the report and walked to the window, watching ground crews service the P-80s parked on the hard stand. I keep thinking about that German pilot, wondering if he made it back, wondering if he's got a family somewhere, people who worry every time he takes off. We all have families, Bong. That's why we're here, to end this war before more people lose theirs. Dick nodded, but the words felt hollow. He had seen too much death in the Pacific, had sent too many men spiraling toward the ocean in flames. Victory was necessary, but it never felt clean, never felt simple. Your next mission is in 48 hours, Webb continued. Final push toward Munich. Intelligence says the Luftwaffe is concentrating what's left of their jet fighters for a last stand. We're going to make sure it's exactly that, their last stand. How many Me-262s are we expecting? Dozen, maybe 15 if they scrape together every operational aircraft, against our full squadron of 20 P-80s, plus conventional fighter support. Webb's expression was grim. It won't be a fair fight, Dick, but war never is. April 3rd, 1945, Lechfeld Air Base, 0430 hours. Klaus Steiner hadn't slept. He sat in the empty briefing room, smoking his last cigarette and studying the map on the wall. The red pins marking Allied positions had crept so close that Germany now resembled a shrinking island in a sea of enemies. The door opened and Weber limped in, his ankle still wrapped but his determination evident. "You're supposed to be grounded," Klaus said without looking up. "So are you, if the doctors had their way." Weber pulled up a chair. "Word is that tomorrow's mission is the big one. Every operational Me-262 in the sector, one final coordinated strike. A final stand, you mean? Is there a difference anymore?" Klaus stubbed out his cigarette and finally met Weber's eyes. The young pilot had aged a decade in 2 weeks. They all had. "What are you doing here, Weber? Really?" "I want back in the air, Herr Major. I know I'm supposed to be scared after what happened, supposed to be traumatized or whatever the doctors call it, but all I feel is incomplete. Like I started something I need to finish. Even if finishing it means not coming back?" Weber was quiet for a moment, then smiled, a small, sad expression that held more wisdom than any 22-year-old should possess. "My father flew in the First War. He used to tell me that the worst thing wasn't dying in combat. It was surviving while your comrades fell, living with the guilt of being the one who made it home." "Your father was right," Klaus said softly. "I've carried that weight for 3 years now. Watched friends disappear into the clouds and never return. Written letters to families I'll never meet, explaining how their sons or husbands or fathers died with honor. It doesn't get easier, Weber. It just becomes familiar. Then let me carry some of that weight with you, sir. One more mission. Let me be part of the story instead of a footnote." Klaus studied the young man, saw the determination, the courage, the desperate need to matter in a war that had consumed so many without notice. He knew he should refuse, should keep Weber safe for one more day, one more week, however long the war lasted. But he also knew that safety was an illusion, that Weber would find his way into the air regardless, with or without permission. Better to have him in formation, where Klaus could at least try to protect him. "One mission," Klaus finally agreed. "And you follow my orders exactly. No heroics, no glory-seeking. We fly, we fight, we come home. Understood?" "Understood, Herr Major." Weber's relief was palpable. "Thank you." After Weber left, Klaus sat alone in the darkness, wondering if he had just made a terrible mistake. Outside, the first hints of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky. Another day beginning, possibly one of the last he would ever see. April 4th, 1945, 0730 hours, 28,000 feet above Bavaria. The sky was perfect, crystalline blue stretching to infinity, visibility unlimited, temperature minus 40 degrees Celsius. Perfect conditions for the last great aerial battle of the European War. Klaus led a formation of 12 Me-262s, arranged in 3 flights of 4 aircraft each. They climbed steadily toward altitude, their Jumo engines leaving contrails that painted white lines across the morning sky. Behind and around them, the remnants of the Luftwaffe's conventional fighters flew escort, FW-190s and BF-109s, whose piston engines seemed almost quaint compared to the jets they protected. "Adler Leader, this is Control." The radio crackled with the voice of the ground controller. "Multiple contacts inbound. Bearing 090, range 50 kilometers. Estimated strength, 30-plus aircraft." "Acknowledged, Control. All Adler units maintain formation and altitude. Wait for my command." Klaus's hands were steady on the controls despite his racing pulse. This was it, the moment when everything they had trained for, everything they had survived, would culminate in one final test. The Americans were coming with overwhelming force, determined to sweep the Luftwaffe from the sky once and for all, and perhaps they would succeed. "Visual contact." Weber's voice came through, steady and calm. 11 o'clock high. I count at least 20 silver birds. P-80 shooting stars, descending from the sun in a tactical formation that spoke of careful planning and ruthless efficiency. Behind them, higher still, conventional fighters orbited like vultures waiting for the feast to begin. "All units, arm weapons." Klaus flipped the safety cover off his firing button. "Select your targets carefully. Make every shot count. And remember, we're not trying to win the war today. We're just trying to survive it." The 2 formations closed with terrible inevitability, like storm fronts colliding. At a combined speed of over 1,000 kilometers per hour, the gap between them evaporated in seconds. "Adler units, break by flights. Engage at will." The sky exploded into chaos. Klaus rolled his Me-262 toward the nearest P-80, his finger already depressing the trigger. 4 30mm cannons roared, their shells tracing glowing paths through the air. The American jet jinked hard left, evading by meters, then reversed and came around for a counterattack. All around him, aircraft twisted and turned in the deadly ballet of modern air combat. Contrails spiraled and crossed, creating geometric patterns against the blue canvas. Tracer rounds crisscrossed like deadly meteor showers. And through it all, the roar of jet engines, German and American, old and new, past and future colliding at supersonic speeds. "Adler 7 is hit," a voice screamed over the radio. "I'm losing." Static replaced the transmission. Klaus had no time to mourn. The P-80 he was engaging had circled back, its pilot clearly experienced and aggressive. Klaus dove hard, pulling into a split S that brought him inverted and descending. The American followed, staying glued to his tail with mechanical precision. This was the pilot from before. Klaus was certain of it. The same tactics, the same aggressive confidence, the same superior aircraft. And this time, Klaus's bag of tricks was running empty. He pulled through a series of barrel rolls, trying to spoil his opponent's aim. Tracer rounds flashed past his canopy, some so close he could feel the impacts through the airframe. His warning lights illuminated, hits to non-critical systems, but the damage was accumulating. "Herr Major, on your 6. Weber's voice cut through the chaos. "Braking toward you." Klaus saw Weber's Me-262 diving out of the sun, guns blazing, putting himself between Klaus and the pursuing P-80. The American broke off, recognizing the threat, and the 2 jets, Weber's Me-262 and the American P-80, merged into a twisting, turning dogfight that defied belief. Weber fought with the skill of a veteran, using every advantage the Me-262's heavy cannons provided. But the P-80 was faster, more agile, flown by a pilot who had learned from their previous encounter. They spiraled downward, altitude bleeding away, both pilots pushing their aircraft to the absolute limits. Klaus tried to intervene, tried to position himself for a shot that would drive off the American. But another P-80 appeared on his tail, forcing him defensive. He was out of altitude, out of options, out of time. "Weber, break off!" Klaus shouted into his radio. "That's an order." "Negative, Herr Major. I've got him right where—" The transmission ended in a burst of static. Klaus watched in horror as the P-80's guns found their mark. Weber's Me-262 shuddered under the impact, pieces of wing and fuselage torn away by the devastating firepower. The jet entered a flat spin, smoke pouring from both engines, falling toward the earth like a wounded bird. "Weber, bail out now!" But there was no response. No parachute blossomed from the falling aircraft. No escape, no survival, no tomorrow. Weber's Me-262 impacted the ground in a field 15 kilometers south of Munich, creating a fireball that rose hundreds of feet into the morning sky. Klaus felt something inside him break, not dramatically, not with tears or screams, but quietly, like a cable under too much tension finally snapping. Weber was dead. Another name for another casualty list, another letter to another family. Another ghost to join the hundreds that already haunted Klaus's dreams. "Adler leader, this is Adler 2. A voice penetrated his shock. "We've lost 6 aircraft. The Americans are pulling back. Do we pursue?" Klaus looked at his fuel gauge, nearly empty. Looked at his warning lights, half the panel illuminated. Looked at the sky around him, empty of friendly aircraft save for the scattered survivors of his formation. "Negative, Adler 2. All units RTB. Mission complete." But it wasn't complete. It would never be complete. They had lost 6 Me-262s, 6 irreplaceable pilots. For what? To delay the inevitable by one more day? To prove they could still fight when everyone knew the outcome was predetermined? As Klaus turned his damaged aircraft toward base, he spotted the P-80 that had engaged Weber. It was climbing back to altitude, its silver skin reflecting the morning sun, unscathed and victorious. The American pilot rocked his wings once. Not in mockery, Klaus realized, but in acknowledgement. Warrior to warrior, pilot to pilot. A salute across the lines of nationality and ideology. Klaus understood then that the American pilot felt no joy in Weber's death, just as Klaus felt no hatred for the man who had caused it. They were all just men doing impossible jobs in an impossible war, counting down the days until it ended, or they did. He raised his hand in response, though he knew the American couldn't see it. Then he pointed his broken aircraft toward home and prayed it would stay airborne long enough to get him there. April 4th, 1945, 1600 hours, Lechfeld Air Base. The debriefing was mercifully short. 6 Me-262s lost, 4 pilots confirmed dead, 2 missing. Against this, they claimed 1 P-80 damaged and 2 conventional American fighters destroyed. The mathematics of defeat were clear and undeniable. Colonel Dietrich looked like a man attending his own funeral. High Command has ordered the remaining Me-262s withdrawn to bases further east. Lechfeld is to be evacuated within 48 hours. Klaus nodded numbly. It didn't matter anymore. None of it mattered. "Major Steiner, you and your remaining pilots are reassigned to training duties. No more combat missions." "Sir?" "You heard me, Major. This—" Dietrich gestured vaguely at the map, at the reports, at the entire crumbling edifice of German air power. "This is over. The war will continue for weeks, perhaps months, but our part in it is finished. I won't waste more experienced pilots in a fight we cannot win." Klaus should have felt relief, should have felt grateful. Instead, he felt empty, a hollow shell where a person used to be. That evening, Klaus walked to the field where Weber's aircraft had crashed. The impact crater was still smoking, surrounded by guards and recovery teams. Not much remained, some twisted metal, some unidentifiable fragments, some scorched earth that would forever mark where a young man's life had ended. Klaus knelt beside the crater and pulled from his pocket the letter Weber had given him weeks ago. Sealed, addressed to his parents in Hamburg, with instructions to mail it if anything happens. "You were a good pilot, Weber," Klaus said quietly to the smoking ground. "Better than you knew. And you were right. You got to be part of the story instead of a footnote. I'll make sure they remember that." He stood and walked back toward the base, the letter clutched in his hand. Behind him, the sun set over Bavaria, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that looked like fire, looked like blood, looked like the end of everything they had fought for. April 30th, 1945, RAF Manston. Dick Bong sat in the officers' club, a glass of whiskey in front of him, untouched. Around him, pilots celebrated. The war in Europe was ending. Everyone could feel it. Hitler was dead, Berlin was falling, and the Luftwaffe was grounded for lack of fuel and aircraft. They had won. So why did he feel like he'd lost something important? "Thinking about that German pilot?" Colonel Webb asked, sliding into the chair opposite. "Which one?" "I shot down 3 Me-262s in the last month." "The one whose wingman you got. The one who gave you that salute." Dick was quiet for a moment, then nodded. "Yeah, him. I wonder if he made it through. If he's going home to a family somewhere. Does it matter? It should, shouldn't it? I mean, we're supposed to hate them, supposed to see them as the enemy. But up there, in those few seconds when we're both just trying to survive, we're not so different." Webb sighed and took a drink from his own glass. "No, we're not. That's the tragedy of it, Dick. Every war is fought between men who have more in common than they do differences. But we fight anyway, because someone decided that's what needs to happen. And after? When the shooting stops? Then we go home and try to forget. Try to live with what we did and what we saw. Try to be the men our families remember instead of the ones we became." Dick finally lifted his whiskey and drank, the burn providing momentary distraction from thoughts that wouldn't quiet. Somewhere in Germany, in a bunker or a prison camp or a makeshift hospital, the German pilot was probably thinking similar thoughts. Two men on opposite sides of a war neither had started, both wondering if survival was enough or if something more was required. The answer, Dick suspected, would take a lifetime to find. May 8th, 1945, near Salzburg, Austria. Klaus Steiner stood on a hillside overlooking a valley where American troops had established a temporary camp. In his hand, he held the identification papers that marked him as a prisoner of war, his flying days officially over. The war had ended 3 hours ago. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. The Third Reich was no more. Klaus felt neither relief nor despair. Just exhaustion. The bone-deep weariness of a man who had given everything and received nothing in return except the dubious gift of survival. "Major Steiner?" An American lieutenant approached, his German accented but understandable. "The commander wants to speak with you. This way, please." Klaus followed, his mind drifting to Weber, to the dozens of other pilots he had lost, to the thousands more who would never see this day. What would they think, he wondered, if they knew how it ended? Not in glory, not in heroic sacrifice, but in simple exhaustion. Two sides too tired to continue, one side too broken to resist. The American commander was a colonel, his uniform pristine compared to Klaus's threadbare flight suit. "Major Steiner. Please, sit." Klaus remained standing. "I prefer not to, sir." "Suit yourself." The colonel studied him with eyes that had seen too much combat to hold contempt. "You flew Me-262s?" "Yes, sir." "Encountered our P-80s?" "Several times, sir." The colonel nodded slowly. "My pilots speak highly of Luftwaffe jet pilots. Said you were skilled, experienced, tough to beat even with superior aircraft." "We did our duty, sir. Nothing more." "And now?" Klaus looked out the window at the valley below, at the camp filled with men who had been his enemies yesterday and were simply men today. "Now, we try to remember why we fought. Try to build something from the ruins. Try to ensure this never happens again." "Noble words, Major." Empty words, Colonel. I've learned that nobility and combat don't coexist well, but perhaps in peace they have a chance. The colonel stood and extended his hand. The war is over, Major Steiner. Whatever happens next, I hope it's better than what came before. Klaus looked at the offered hand, a gesture of respect between warriors, between survivors, between two men who understood that the true victory wasn't defeating the enemy, but remaining human despite everything. He shook the colonel's hand. Outside, the sun set on the last day of the European War. In the fading light, Klaus thought he saw contrails high overhead, American P-80s on patrol, ensuring the peace held, silver shapes against a darkening sky, beautiful and deadly and forever changed. The Luftwaffe commanders who had laughed at American jet technology were silent now, dead, captured, or in hiding. Their laughter had been replaced by the roar of P-80 shooting stars, aircraft that had proven superior in every way that mattered. But Klaus didn't think about superiority anymore. He thought about Weber, about young men who would never grow old, about the cost of laughter that came too easily and pride that blinded wisdom. And he thought about tomorrow, the first day of a peace bought with more blood than any victory deserved. The war was over. Now came the harder part, learning to live with what they had done to survive it.